Once was a swagman camped by a billabong under the shade of a coolabah tree. As he sat, as he watched and waited while his billy boiled, who'll come a waltzing Matilda with me? Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. This is the inaugural Freedom Forum. We've got a special guest today, and I'd like to welcome him from New South Wales. Welcome, Philip Benwell.
Thank you.
No worries. Thank you. Now, the forum today, the interview with Philip, is in regard to our limited constitutional monarchy, the development of that system of government, and the proposal or the lack of clear direction of a proposal for a republic, and also the methodology that is being mentioned, possibly being used, that is a postal survey. And so these things are most important. We've got to wrestle with this thing and think about the ramifications of it, because it's not something that we should consider lightly, but something that's going to have ramifications for our children and our children's children. So, Philip Benwell, welcome to our show, and you have the floor.
Thank you. Well, as most people will know, if Labour wins the next general election, which could be held later this year or early next year, he has pledged to bring on a postal survey or a series of postal surveys to condition the people into accepting the inevitability of a republic. It is a slight on our democracy because our constitution provides for amendment to it, and that is by way of a referendum of the people, not by a series of voluntary postal surveys where there is no information on what people are voting about and where the government selects the question. There's no opposition input into the question. The government selects the question. It devises a question to elicit the answer that they want. It is certainly not democratic, and it is a misuse of government.
Thank you, Philip. That's a very good opening salvo. The point I get from that is that if the vote is voluntary, and the fact is there's a story of there's the Garradine swine, mobs easily manipulated by slogans and short-term thinking, and that sort of stuff. And of course, it can be the undoing of a people. And we've got to be especially cautious about this. And it's really not I don't see it as a Liberal or Labor issue. I see it as a preparing us as a nation to slip us under the control of the United Nations. And that's what the Republic model is about. And it's been insidious, and it's been going on for hundreds of years, since the French Revolution. And I've just been reading several books, at least glancing through them, and I'm just going to touch on those books right now, just as we go further on into this. The first is The New Despotism by Lord Hewitt, and essentially it talks about the rule of law, and it highlights the difference between the rule of law and arbitrary lawlessness by bureaucracy, and there's an enormous amount of difference. And then, of course, this other book, The Passing of Parliament, and that's by Professor Keaton. And this is really an update from the New Despotism. And then finally, Our Sham Democracy, or The Majority Vote Racket by James Guthrie, which is on the Australian League of Rights website in their library. And all these books are most important because the ramifications in the discussion are not just short-term, not just minor. They're quite profound. And in the area of our constitution, it has ramifications that go on for 100 years. The constitution is more than 100 years old, and it's held us in good stead. And we need to actually take this discussion even further, and that is perhaps going back to the history of our constitution and the evolution of it. Philip.
Yes, well, the constitution began in the middle of the 19th century when the British government decided that Australia should be more independent than it was at the time. They'd learned their lesson from the loss of the American colonies. Of course, it was that loss of the American colonies that brought about the first settlement in Australia, because Britain needed somewhere to house its unwanted convicts. America took vast numbers, but when the doorway there was closed, they looked to Canada, but Canada didn't want them. They looked to South Africa, South Africa didn't want them. So then they looked to Australia, and that's how our first settlement came about. They appointed as the first governor a brilliant person in Governor Arthur Phillip, because he had a huge foresight. He ensured that the convicts and the soldiers during the long journey to Australia had fresh fruit and vegetables. The first thing he did was to plant vegetable gardens when he arrived, and it was due to him that Australia, as the nation we know it today, has grown out of those humble beginnings. But from the earlier years of the mid-19th century, democracy began to grow, and essentially from the 1980s onwards, there were a series of conventions attended to by leading statesmen from all states, who, or the colonies as they were known then, to discuss the federation of the states, because each state was independent. Each state had reported direct to the British government. And eventually a constitution was formulated. And we should remember, it was drafted by Australians. It wasn't something put upon us by the British. It was drafted by Australians, and many of the terms were argued with the British politicians by our leading statespersons, and our people won. Now, for instance, the referendum proposal, where amendment to the Constitution is put in the hands of the people, was originally not acceptable by the British Parliament, because their thinking was Parliament is supreme, and therefore Parliament should have the power to change the Constitution. But as it happened, under our Constitution, which came into being in 1901, it is the people who have the responsibility and the power to change, and only the people, not the politicians, not the Queen, not the British Parliament, but the Australian people, and they alone.
Thank you for that, Philip. That's beautifully put. And I'm reminded you touched on something I think that's most important, and that was that the loss of the American colonies. Now, I'm of the view, and I could be wrong, but I don't think I am, that essentially it was the American colonies rejected the supremacy of Parliament. They rejected it because the British Parliament insisted they had the right to tax the colonies, and so it was rejecting that supremacy of Parliament. Now, what we see in those books that I highlighted previously was we talk about the supremacy of the executive over the Parliament, and we're seeing that today. Now, I know we've touched on the history of the constitutional monarchy, but we've also got to look at the protocols that's actually being exercised today, and which are actually undermining the good function of our constitution. And I put it to you, Philip, that what I'm seeing that the executive, or at least the leadership within a particular dominant party, is ruling by a dictate, and of course they're supported with the bureaucracy and the advisory bodies, the not only the bureaucrats but also the lobbyists, in order to pursue policy over and above the Parliament. And so it's not actually coming back to the people's house where they can discuss these things, where their representatives can discuss these things. So in my view, Parliament is being undermined, and it's being undermined by the party system and, if you like, bureaucratic lawlessness. Philip.
Well, I possibly have a little different opinion because I believe that a major problem within our parliament is the caliber of our politicians and the fact that they look to themselves and not to the country. And this has basically come about because the political parties elect their politicians from within their own staffs. So you have a young person that goes to university, gets a degree in law or political science, works for an MP or minister, then is able to get pre-selection and goes into parliament without any experience in the outside world. And if we're talking about the federal parliament, Canberra, which I think is a mistake because it is an isolationist city in on its own without any real interaction or knowledge of what goes on in the outside world. And so you've got this bubble that is ruling us. You've got a bureaucracy that is within that bubble that is ruling us. It's becoming self-perpetuating. And they are making laws that have no real relevance to the day-to-day lives of people today. Now, of course, a lot of this has come about because of the two-party system, where either the Liberal Party or the Labour Party have control over our parliament. The minor independents may be able to get a few seats in the Senate, but rarely in the lower house, which is the real decision-making body. So it's controlled by either one party or another, and allegiance is not so much to the country, but to the political party that politicians belong to. That is wrong. Now, if you go back into the days before the 1960s, say, a member of parliament would resign rather than commit to something he or she doesn't agree with. Today, they will agree to it. Look what happened with the vote on same-sex marriage. Several of the major opponents to same-sex marriage just went to water once the insidious postal survey results came in. And they didn't stand up against it. Some abstained and some voted for it. Only one minister in the federal ministry voted against. Only one minister out of all the numbers that spoke against it. Only one minister voted against the legislation. And I think that is symptomatic of the problems we have within the parliament, where integrity is missing and replaced by ambition and self-seeking.
Thank you, Philip. That's an excellent observation, and of course, my concern with the machinations of the party system is that they lose contact because of the whip system and because of the actual party rooms that are in the Parliament House, the party rooms, and the decisions made there, and of course the lobbyists who chew the ear or swan the minister or the politician or the bureaucrat in charge, and of course this is the ramifications of it. Most profound. I look at this Adani mine in Queensland. I mean, there's significant resistance to it, significant local resistance. They don't want it, and here it is. Yes, we'd love the jobs, but do we really want to tear up this paddock? And in South Australia, the same thing. There was significant resistance against this nuclear waste dump. And I know that the system set up didn't achieve the nuclear waste dump, but the fact is that they use every trick in the book to try and do it. And you talk about integrity. Integrity, I keep on observing that the land that was allocated, or at least one of the major players or most highly likely place for the nuclear waste dump, was under lease to a politician or a former politician. I mean, come on. This is we're talking integrity here. These people are supposed to be beyond reproach, and it's not happening. It's not happening, and so it really comes back to, in my view, what we're seeing is, and I think it's, and I guess it's a hard thing to say, but it's probably true. What we're seeing is that the laid-back Aussie is sitting having a tinny, watching the footy or watching the cricket, and we're watching our country melt in front of our eyes. We're watching our civilization melt, and in my view, we've got to grab the bull by the horns. We've got to start accepting responsibility. Dare I say it, good Australian blokes, we need to harden up, we need to grow up and accept this responsibility of this life in front of us, because it's vital. We won't. They'll keep on feeding us beer and circuses while Rome fell. They'll keep doing it. And is this the legacy we're going to hand on to our children? It's not the right one. It's not the right way to go. Now we've got to look at this constitutional question, the ramifications of it, and the republic, and the bureaucracy, the fact that the acts come out as a law, but then you've got all the regulations that go with it. That of course is the bureaucratic lawlessness, the regulations that go with it. It's not even doesn't even see the light of day with Parliament. Philip.
Yes, what has happened over the past few decades is the creation of the executive prime ministership, which is virtually equal to an executive presidency, where the prime minister makes most of the day-to-day decisions. He may or she may pass some of them through the cabinet and a few more through the party room. But the prime minister within his political party is looked upon as a god. I've seen it. When I've spoken against the actions of a prime minister, I've been told, oh, you shouldn't be saying that about so-and-so. He's the prime minister. This is ridiculous. And it's part of the problems we have. But it's not due to our constitution. It's due to the manipulation of our political system. And I believe that if we become a republic and we lose the crown, because that's what it means. It's not just replacing the Queen with a president. It is removing the crown from within our constitution. And the crown is always there to protect, as far as possible, the freedoms of the people. There is a line that politicians cannot cross. On the one side of that line, they are making hay while the sun shines. They are increasing their power. They are passing all sorts of nanny state laws to control us. But they would love to cross that line and have absolute power. But they can't, because that line is there as long as our constitution is maintained and as long as the Governor-General owes allegiance to the Queen and not to the politicians.
Thank you, Philip. I think that's... Hang on. I'll lose your audio as soon as I cut over. I'm just going to touch on something here, and that is that the Governor-General, or the Governor of the States, is the supreme leader, if you like, of our armed services. And also, within our Constitution, a very important point to note is the ability for even one person to petition the Governor or the Governor-General. They can petition, and if the argument is solid, then the Governor-General can actually respond to that petition. He can't initiate new laws, but he can certainly respond. And we saw that in South Australia with the Bank Watch group. They were campaigning because of the exploitation of the banks in a time of severe hardship. and on the Eyre Peninsula farmers, and where they were unnecessarily foreclosing, and then writing off the loan and then selling the farm for nothing. So they actually didn't achieve anything. And if they'd left the original farmer in position and just read off the loan and cleared it, you could have had an experienced farmer continue the campaign, because the extended drought was causing enormous hardship. Now, they were petitioning the governor, and it's not unusual to do that. Now, you do away with that system, and you won't have that last line of recourse. That last line of recourse, which of course is, and the other of course is that as the head of the armed services, the Governor General, as the head of the armed services, I was in the armed services, I know it. You swear allegiance to the Queen or the Queen's representative. As the head of the armed services, it would be very difficult for a president to turn the army on their own people, and that to me is most important, to consider these things. It's they're in place for a very good reason, and we've got to think very deeply about it. Philip.
Yes, the Governor General is Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Services as representative of the Queen. And that's important because upon appointment, the Governor General assumes the role of the monarch in the country, and he becomes our executive head of state. And he has a lot of power that he can use if necessary. Now, in speaking to a former Governor General, he did use it behind the scenes, because if a Governor General stands up and castigates a government or criticizes a government or says that they're not doing the right thing, then it'll get into the press and they'll make all sorts of sensational nonsense about it. But the fact is, most of the work of the Governor General, the constitutional work, is done behind the scenes. The Governor General has the right to call in a minister or the Prime Minister and to require them to change an act or to explain why they have certain provisions in a bill that they put forward, or to ask questions about something that they're doing. He is the chairman of the Executive Council. He is the person that issues the letter of appointment to the Prime Minister and to the ministers. They are answerable in many ways to him. He can withdraw the commission at any time from any politician, any minister, any Prime Minister, as happened in 1975 when the Parliament was at a stalemate and the then Prime Minister Whitlam refused to go to the people. He simply withdrew the letter of appointment and appointed Malcolm Fraser as caretaker Prime Minister on the basis that he goes to the people immediately, which is what happened. And it was the people who had their say. That's our democracy. It must go to the people, and politicians would like nothing else than to change the rules so that they don't have to go to the people on a regular basis.
Thank you, Philip. That's an excellent summary. I see the Governor General as the umpire. I see the Queen, the Governor General, as the Queen's representative, as the umpire, and that he has the ability, or she has the ability, as Governor General, to withhold assent to an act if they believe that it's not the will of the people. And I'd also point out that the opportunity to petition the Governor General is most important. These are profound things that we've got to consider in our assessment of a constitutional monarchy or the republic. And the final point I'll make before I hand it back to you, Philip, I believe the republic is the politicians' republic. It's the politicians' republic, and it's not the people's republic. It's not a division of power. It's actually a centralising of power, and I believe that that's the ultimate intention behind it, is that the lawlessness that we're seeing within the bureaucracy, within the supremacy of Parliament, over and above the people, and I believe we've got to actually restore order, and none of that can happen until such time as the people seize the initiative and insist on restoring power back to the people in a moral and ethical manner, and of course in a legal manner. Philip.
Yes, I quite agree. Of course, um, what the Republicans want to do is to um, create a situation where the people would feel comfortable about saying yes to different things. The postal surveys, which are terribly insidious, it's a very insidious method of getting an answer that the politicians want from the people. The postal survey will have no yes and no case. Now, the yes people, the Republicans, don't need information to be given because they control the media. They also have millions of dollars given to them by their big business buddies. The monarchists have no money or very little money. The government doesn't give them any money, and therefore they must do what they can to let the people know. It was the same situation with the same-sex marriage campaign, where the proponents of same-sex marriage were funded by business. They were able to get their message out, whereas the opponents of same-sex marriage didn't have much money and couldn't get a message out to every single household. It's different with a referendum process because there are rules and guidelines. But of course, the government would want to thwart that process and condition people into saying yes. But the danger is for us, if in the first postal survey, do you want an Australian as head of state? The people say, yes, why not? Or those who respond. You need only get 55% of the population who respond, and it's considered to be a yes case if there's a majority of those. Then the government will say the people want a republic. It will undermine our constitution because we're talking about changing the constitution that basically controls the governance of this country. It underwrites the governance of this country. And we're looking at casting a no confidence vote. A lot of people will also think, oh, well, people want a republic, that's it. And then the second postal survey will be what sort of republic? And then there'll be a referendum. By that time, we would have lost most of the politicians, which means that the no vote in the parliament will be much, much less, which means that funding for the no case will be much, much less. So the whole thing is heading for a disaster for us unless the people stand up, realize what is happening, and say, no way. Now, the problem that we all face with everything in our system of governance is the apathy of the people. That's why politicians are allowed to get away with what they get away with. The apathy of the people. People sitting down and couldn't care less. If you look at the football matches, huge stadiums full of people. It's a circus for the people. But when you talk about anything that's serious, such as the future of our constitution or the future of the way of our way of life, then a lot of people are not interested. And of course, this is something that we've all got to try and resolve.
Thank you, Philip. That's beautifully put. And we're coming up to the half-hour mark, so I'm going to look for closing comments in a minute. It comes back to the individual. The fact is, our constitution will only work and will continue to be successful with the participation of the individual, with the participation of the people. We've actually got to engage, and it doesn't mean once in 3 years you put a tick in a box or you number some squares. That's not engagement. Our engagement is that we have a duty, a responsibility to inform our representative of our will. And that means that we need to take our time and consider the ramifications of how the system works, of what the proposals are, the new laws, things like that, even the existing laws or the existing regulations, the existing outworking of some of the things that are going on in our universities or our places of education or with our public hospitals or whatever. All of these things are affecting us as a community, as a society. And it in the sense that we either use it or lose it. And that's what's before us. And I think it's most profound that we've got to actually have a go here. It's our time. 100 years ago, my grandfather, as a young boy, 14, 15 years old, was in the trenches 100 years ago. And then 50, 70 years ago, he was in the trenches again. That was as a father of six and a godfather to one. I mean, come on, these were serious times. And it's no different now. Those things that he did, his family put up with, they suffered. That was for a very good reason. And we're inheriting part of that. That's our legacy. That's our inheritance. And we've got to consider the ramifications of our inheritance and not squander it. Philip, closing comments, please.
Yes, you were quite right. It's up to the individual to stand up for the things that he or she believes in. There are too few people doing that. It may be difficult, but nevertheless, it's it's what people have to do if they want to maintain our way of life. Things are not free. We have to work to and support them and to stand up for them. And we've got a wonderful way of life in this country. We don't want it frittered away because people sit down and leave it all to politicians who have their own interests to look after. The question that you have or the statement you made about petitioning, that's quite correct. If there's something happening within your electorate, contact your state and federal MPs, whichever area the matter belongs to, and make their life hell. Phone them up, write to them, get others to write to them, because every letter they get means perhaps 100 votes. But of course, politicians now hide behind layers of people. They have a lot of staff, and the staff are there to put you off. They generally hide their contact details, but you can find them out. Make their life hell because they are there not to serve themselves, not just to sit in the parliament. They are there to serve each and every person within the electorate, whether that person voted for them or not, whether that person is a member of their political party or not, whether that person contributes to their campaign or not. Each person within the electorate must be looked after by their member of parliament. That is the member's job, and we should hold them to it.
Excellent. Thank you very much for that, Philip. A very good forum, and it illustrates in my mind clearly that we have a duty, and we must not renege on that duty, but take up our own mantle and accept it. That this generation has got a huge inheritance. It has a huge legacy. Part of that is our constitution. Part of it is our history of common law. Part of it is the infrastructure that we go and watch our football games in, and enjoy a beer at the pub. Part of that is that we can hope to have our our own home and family and things like that. Our country is a country of abundance. But the fact is, our country is under threat. And it's under threat from some of the people in our own country. They have another idea of it. And their loyalty isn't necessarily to Australia, but perhaps to a United Nations overarching control of everything that goes on. This is the bureaucratic lawlessness that I referred to. Arnis Luks at the Freedom Forum. Once was a swagman camped by a billabong under the shade of a coolabah tree. As he sat, as he watched and waited while his billy boiled, will come a waltzing Matilda with